Good evening, everybody. Buonasera a tutte e a tutti. Welcome to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I won't be talking much now. I'm just introducing tonight's event. This is the second installment of an initiative which we started last year. It's called Translation Marathon. Last year we had a ball with Giacomo Leopardi. He read the Infinito in multiple languages, spanning the globe. And for the second installment, we thought about going backwards in time, and we are focusing on Renaissance poetry. Interestingly enough, we are going to look at the poetry of two wonderful poets, Louise Labé and Gaspara Stampa. So we are bonding with our friends in French studies. We are very happy to do that. And even more broadly, we are bonding with several other colleagues around. We are very delighted that this initiative continues to bring Italian studies together with liberal studies, and in particular the translation program over there and the translation minor. I just will hand it over right away to the person who has been coordinating this event, both last year and this year. And this is one of our grad students, Scott Kapuscinski, who is a second-year grad student in the program. He's not only someone who works on Italian studies and poetry in particular, with a focus on pre-modern literature, but he's also a translator, and so someone who has much to say about the practice, the arts and crafts of translating, and also, the theory of translation. And I would like to thank Scott, because in a very busy semester, busy for everybody, he has been able to pull all the threads and keep us all sort of involved. So he will be introducing our guests. We will have not only students reading and discussing translations, but also esteemed colleagues and friends speaking about these authors. And so we're up for a treat. So let's just welcome Scott to the podium and enjoy the evening.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Scott Kapuscinski. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Eugenio. And so I will just go ahead and introduce our two ladies of the evening, I suppose, Gaspara Stampa Louise Labé. Just very briefly, a little bit of background information about them. Of course, this is Stampa here on the left and Labé on the right. So starting with Stampa, she is regarded by many as perhaps the greatest Italian woman poet of any age, with her works that we are going to be reading from tonight published posthumously by her sister Cassandra. She lived primarily in Venice in the first half of the 16th century. She was born into a house that became something of a literary club in its own right, so she was definitely someone who was surrounded by the arts in her time, and her work of over 300 poems are largely not necessarily dedicated, but largely involve her love for the Count Colaltino di Colalto. She also managed to make Harold Bloom's list of the most important Italian artists of the aristocratic age, the age between, for Bloom, the theocratic and the democratic. She, of course, wrote her sonnets primarily in the Petrarchan tradition, so much so, in fact, that her first sonnet even begins, Voi qu'ascoltate in queste meste rime, which is, of course, a direct acknowledgement of Petrarch's first, from the canzoniere, Voi che ascoltate in rime sparse il suono. Jane Tylus, who we have with us tonight, notes that the world of the rime is largely an internal one, which I think is also a point worth noting in this context, because within Italian poetry, I feel that it is very much Petrarch who turns inward in many ways. As opposed to his predecessors, of course, the great narrative structure of Dante, for example, more external. So in that way, Stampa's interiority is very much following from Petrarch, I would say, in a lot of ways. But Stampa, in her own right, was not merely a follower, but also, as Tylus points out, she wanted to be a paro, that is, walking side by side, not only with Petrarca, but also with the famed Grecian poetess Sappho. Labé, on the other hand, also born into a family of some means. They both come from, you could say, wealthy merchant backgrounds. In the case of Labé, her family was wealthy rope makers, so she also got the moniker La Belle Cordière. That's my French for you. But her sonnets are among the first to be written in French. The Petrarchan sonnet was known within her surrounding, although her direct borrowings are perhaps a little bit less so than Stampa, who goes so far as to acknowledge in her first, as I was saying before, Labé does not do the same. Edith Farrell notes that Labé chose a 10-syllable line rather than the Alexandrine. While the French refer to the line as the decasyllable, it is comparable to the Italian hendecasyllable because the accent remains on the 10th syllable, which is the second to last in the Italianate model. So there's perhaps a little bit of overlap in the style that we could perhaps talk about later tonight. However, Labé's work overall, I would say, is, in a sense, more Petrarchan in terms of its corpus, insofar as, while on the one hand, Stampa writes many more sonnets, Petrarch and also Labé wrote a number of prose pieces as well. Labé is known also for her debate between folly and love. Both of these women were met with some public scrutiny regarding their character in their time. As women writing centrally charged poetry, they gained a certain notoriety among many who heard and more or less appreciated their works. To that end, some have even speculated as to the veracity of Labé's authorship, although this position has been largely dismissed. Both these women were afforded the privilege of what Virginia Woolf claims is necessary for a woman to write, that is, a room of one's own. They certainly both had a room of one's own. And as Rainer Maria Rilke implores in his Duino Elegies, have you remembered, Gaspara Stampa, sufficiently yet that any girl whose lover has gone might feel from that intenser example of love, could I only become like her? Should not these ancient sufferings be finally fruitful for us? Rilke does not leave out Labé, though, and also notes that she is a model. Labé is a model for lovers secure and undivided in their passion. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So tonight, in the first part of our evening for you, we've got original translations. These are amatoriali, as we say. These are the works of the love of the craft from our very own undergraduates. And we can expect to hear works tonight in Mandarin, Spanish, hopefully Japanese if Shunyao is here, English, Vietnamese, and then again in Mandarin. So why don't we just get started? We'll start first with Arundel. Arundel Wan is a junior majoring in comparative literature in the College of Arts and Sciences with a minor business at Stern. She is also the founding president of the Chinese Calligraphy Club at NYU. Her field of interest lies in post-colonial theory and decolonization studies, intersecting with digital humanities. Born in Beijing, China, Arundel cultivated both Mandarin and classical Chinese, providing a theoretical framework for her translation project on one of the Romantic poems by Gaspara Stampa. Arundel's engagement with translation will continue across culture, in which she hopes to act as a contemporary middle person, translating between Chinese and English literature and political works to promote mutual understanding among cultures. Arundel? One last thing. Is it too early? Are these not on yet? Oh, it's at the bottom. Hello? There we go. All right, so we've also got our very own Ida Kayatsu, who is first going to read, thank you, Arundel, first going to read the poem, the sonnet in Italian.
Era vicino il dì che il creatore, che nell'altezza sua poté restarsi, in forma umana venne a dimostrarsi, dal ventre virginale uscendo fore. Quando degnò l'illustre mio Signore, per cui ho tanti poi lamenti sparsi, potendo in luogo più alto annidarsi, farsi nido e ricetto nel mio core. Ond'io sì rara e sì alta ventura accolsi lieta, e duolmi sol che tardi mi fe degna di lei l'eterna cura. Da indi in qua pensieri e speme e sguardi, volsi a lui tutti, fuor d'ogni misura, chiaro e gentil quanto il sol giri e guardi.
So hi everyone, I'm Arundel, and today I'm going to share my perspective on one of Gaspara Stampa's poem. And as you can see, like for translation in Mandarin, there's mainly like two approaches. One is contemporary Mandarin and another is classical Chinese. And so the approach I took was contemporary one, because as you can see, like the format, there's like more words than others, like between the lines. And I think like by translating into contemporary like version, I could like potentially reach like a larger audience than classical ones. Yeah, and I think I'm going to first read the poems in Chinese. I know a lot of you don't speak it, but I think like it's good to feel like the rhythm of it. Okay. 正值造物主化身为人，显现真身之日前夕，他本可留住于那高耸的神域，却选择由圣母处降生。便是在此时，我显赫的主，我曾为他洒下无数哀痛之泪。他本可栖身于更崇高之境，却在我心中筑起爱巢，寻得慰藉。这罕见的福泽，我欣然领受。唯遗憾，永恒的关怀令我如此迟晚才配得上这一切。自那时起，我的思绪、希望与目光，尽皆追随于他。在烈日之下，论及谦和与威名，他无与伦比。Okay, so you can get a feel of how it sounds in Chinese. And next, I'm going to go like not line by line, but I'm going to do a close reading of the passage. So it's the first one, like the first line. It was near the day that the Creator came in human form to reveal himself. And we can see that the Creator, so it represents the God, right? And this is like one of the technique it uses is called circumlocution. So it means that, so like we know like there's a jargon called beehive, but what if we forgot the term? So we can say like the house where the bee lives. So that is circumlocution. It means that instead of addressing the situation directly, we like take a round. We kind of indirectly approach the word in another way. So it was near the day. The day actually referred to Christmas. Okay, so it meant that Stampa and her lover, they met during Christmas. Okay. Actually, like when I translated into Chinese, I kind of like reorganized the like how to say like the subjects between different words, because in Chinese you put the decorative information first and then the essence later on into the sentence, whereas in English you put the result of you put the result first, like who did something, like the important information first beforehand. For example, like in English you say the book I bought in store yesterday, but in Chinese you would say translated into English it would be like I yesterday in store the book bought. So we can say there's kind of like different in this order of sentences. And for the second one I labeled in blue. In Chinese it's called 神谕, and in English in English it referred to domain, lofty domain. So when I encounter the word domain, I tend to think of like region or area, and I think like for these words they are kind of like informal, and so I wanted to choose like a word that can represent the godliness of this poem. So I chose yu. It is actually two words. It can be separated. So on the left hand, it means like tu means like land. And on the right, it means country. So this emphasizes like a vastness or sacred meaning to like that can represent domain instead of like a smaller one like region or area. And as we go on to the virginal womb, it is comparing Colatino, her lover, to Jesus, and Stampa herself is referring as Virgin Mary. Instead of translating the womb directly into a more clinical or biological term into Chinese, I chose to translate it as Virgin Mary's, just like that, like the place of Virgin Mary's. Because like, I think the womb, this word in Chinese, the meaning is kind of like deteriorated, because like in Chinese it means 子宫, 子 means offspring, and 宫 it means palace. So it's kind of like the palace of the offspring, like in the mother's place. But like as in Qing dynasty, like in the early 19,000s, when Western anatomy came into China, this word 子宫, meaning womb, actually carried a more scientific meaning than in the past. So in present, like modern people often refer this word in a more like clinical setting instead of more like lyrical meaning, yeah. And I think there's also something similar in English, because when we hear the word matrix, right, we often think of computation or the matrix, or like some pop culture related, or even math, like in linear algebra. But actually like the word matrix, it represents the original of life and also the womb. So we can see like how these meanings of words shift as like science or like culture like promotes these words change, yeah. And also the illustrious lord, it means like something very grand and distinguished, and I translate it as 显赫. So you can see there's two syllables, 显 and 赫. So the first syllabus means like something very renowned, and the second word, it means like something eminent. And I think of how it is very interesting, because like 显赫, together it means one meaning, but when it is separate, it has like two meanings also. And I tend to think of the word like cross-culture or cross-discipline in English. You use dash or hyphen to like link these words together to make a new word. But like these, like the word cross and culture, it has different meanings too. Okay, and we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So on the left, the second line, this part, 寻得慰藉. The English means like refuge in my heart, but instead of like translating something as the heart, I simply translate it as comfort, because I think in Chinese, comfort, it carries a very like deep and sensational meaning more than heart. So that is my choice. And also, as we move on to good fortune, I tend to like, there's a difference between good fortune and also good luck. So good luck, in my case, I feel it means more like random or like a flash in the pot. But good fortune, I feel there's like a more lingering sensation towards it. And so in Chinese, I took notice of this difference. So I translated it as 福泽. So there's also two syllables. So the first syllable 福, it means happiness. And the second word is 泽, it means how 泽, you can see there's like 3 dots here, and in Chinese it actually means water. So it's kind of like how the water flows in a big pond. That's the first meaning. And the second meaning is kind of like the radiance or the glow of metal. So you can see this word carries a very like symbolic and like this heavenly meaning towards it. So that is my choice for fortune. Yeah. And so in general, it means that moisture flowing down from the superior. That is like how Stampa referred to her lovers, how the effect of her lover. And we can move on to the last page. So the last page, there's an illusion where I mentioned at the bottom. So who exceeds all others under the sun in courtesy and fame. So the sun here, it is an allusion to the Greek classical myth like Apollo and Clytie. And I'll just like go really simply through the myth. So it is about like Clytie, she's a water nymph, and she admires Apollo very much, but Apollo doesn't like her. And so she sat on the ground for numerous days, and only like turning her head when Apollo, wherever Apollo comes. And so in the end, she turns into a sunflower. So right now, Stampa is alluding to this Greek myth, comparing Collatino as Apollo and herself as the sunflower who traces the sun wherever he goes, to show that her loyalty or her like faith in her lover. Yeah, and so that is pretty much it. I don't have experience in Italian, and so I mainly focused on the English translation to Chinese, and hope my sharing is fine. Thank you.
Yes, there we go. All right, next we have Shunyao. Shunyao. Do we have Shunyao tonight? We might have to skip Shunyao. Okay, sorry, Shunyao. So moving ahead, we have the Spanish version now of Sonnet 9 from Nicole Hurtado. Nicole is studying in the College of Arts and Sciences English literature in creative writing and film production at Tisch. She comes from a Peruvian background, which is the reason she chose to translate in Spanish. And she hopes that in the future she can make a film in another language and would work to translate it to be more accessible to others around the world to see and enjoy. Thank you, Nicole.
Hello. You want to do the introduction first? I can do introduction later, yeah.
S'avvien che un giorno amore a me mi renda e mi ritolga questo empio signore, di che paventa e non vorrebbe il core, tal gioia del penar suo par che prenda, voi chiamerete invan la mia stupenda fede, l'immenso e smisurato amore, di vostra crudeltà, di vostro errore tardi pentito, ove non è chi intenda. Ed io, cantando la mia libertate, da così duri lacci e crudi sciolta, passerò lieta alla futura etade. E se giusto pregare in ciel s'ascolta, vedrò forse anco in man di crudeltade la vita vostra a mia vendetta involta.
I'll go ahead and read my translation first. Si algún día el amor regresa a mí y me libera de ese malvado señor, algo que el corazón teme más de lo que desea, tal alegría parece exprimida del dolor. Invocas mi infinita en vano y mi amor profundo y sin medida. Muy tarde se arrepentirán tu crueldad y error, y nadie estará ahí para escucharte. Y yo, libre de cantar mi libertad, me libraré de los lazos que me atan duros y brutales, me mudaré alegre a alguna edad futura, y si es verdad que el cielo oye solo oraciones, quizás te veré ya en el agarre de la crueldad, tu vida envuelta en mi venganza. So I guess a quick little note, when translating this, I first was planning on doing the Italian to Spanish, since some of my family has moved to most of my family has moved to Italy now, and they live in Florence and Certaldo. And then just scheduling reasons, so I used the English to Spanish translation and got to work with the Spanish department here at NYU. And it was a much harder process than I thought it was going to be from translating English to Spanish, just because the literal meanings just did not make sense in the poems. The poem did not seem very lyrical, and it just did not make sense at all. So I had to go into a deep search into the Spanish dictionary and look for similar words, and there are a lot of words that are similar to Italian as well. But I'm very happy that I got the chance to spend the time with Scott and Ida in the Spanish department, Italian department, to translate. Yeah, thank you.
All right, next up, we've got a translation in English that we can all read. Thank you, Joy. Joy Fraser Cooper is a senior double majoring in Global Liberal Studies and Liberal Studies. She has a wide range of interests, but particularly in environmental sustainability, Italian art and culture, and museum studies. She has been studying Italian for 3 years at NYU and spent her entire junior year at NYU Florence getting firsthand experience with the language. She lived with a homestay family, which provided a lot of opportunities, practice, and became almost fluent. She tries to work on it a little every day. She does not have any professional plans for translation, but plans to continue at least as a hobby because she really enjoys it, especially translating poetry. Thank you, Joy.
Joy, shall I read first, or you want
Oh
to
yeah,
read?
go for it.
Gioia somma, infinito alto diletto, or che l'amato mio tesoro oppresso, or che parlo con lui che il miro spesso, mi ingombrerebbe certamente il petto, se il cor non mi turbasse un sol sospetto, di tosto rimaner sensesso. Per quel che io veggo a qualche segno espresso, che solo apre amor gli occhi all'intelletto. E se cioè io vo certo finire questa misera vita in un momento, anzi che io provi un tanto aspro martire, perché conosco chiaramente e sento che senza lui mi converria morire, che è l'appoggio a cui il viver mio sostento.
All-consuming joy, infinite, dearly beloved, now that I have my beloved treasure near me, now that I speak with him that I often see, my heart certainly would be burdened, if only one fear had my heart not troubled. Soon without him I would be, some expressed sign as I see, that only love the eyes to the mind opened, and if it is, I certainly want to finish this miserable life in a moment, before I feel such anguish, because I clearly feel and know it, that without him I should perish. He is the support that sustains my soulment. That's it. There's a typo in that version. So, fun fact about why I chose this poem, I randomly scrolled to a page in the online text and saw gioia, which I know to be joy in Italian. And I was like, okay, well, this is the one for me. And then from there, I knew that I wanted to try and translate in a way to stay faithful to the rhymes. And so I tried to knew I needed to understand what the poem was saying first, and I tried to do a very literal translation, which left me totally confused. And then my professor, Ida Kayatsa, helped me to kind of rearrange the lines and the stanzas to help understand, because they're in understanding you have to kind of rearrange. And so once I had a grasp on what the meaning was, I started playing around with words and the order in English to try and match the pattern, which was definitely the most challenging part, but also kind of fun in a lot of ways. It meant kind of going away from the direct translation or how it might mean, and focusing more on like the intention of what was trying to be said. And putting things out of order of how they would normally be in English to follow grammar. However, I did discover a little too late that one of the words I translated in the very beginning is wrong. Beloved really should be pleasure, because it's, in this case, the noun, not the adjective. It, like, diletto does translate into beloved, but just shouldn't necessarily be in this case. However, because I did already match all of the rhymes to beloved, and there are not as many rhymes for pleasure or other words that could be a synonym to that, I decided to just go with it, because this is more for fun than anything else. The joy of poetry is exploring its art and seeing how it can be carried through the different languages, and I had a lot of fun with that. So thank you for letting me have this experience.
Oh, yep. All right, so now we are turning from Gaspara Stampa to Louise Labé. We've got our first of two Labé translations here. So, grazie Eugenio. I'm going to try here with the name. Phuong Lan Nguyen? Yes? No? Kind of, sort of? All right, you can correct me up there then. Please say it right. For short, is a sophomore studying computer and data science in the College of Arts and Sciences at NYU. Born and raised in Vietnam, she has been immersed in both Vietnamese and English from a young age through her education at an international school. This bicultural experience shapes both her academic interests and personal hobbies, as she enjoys everything from cafe culture to thrifting. Lan believes that it would be a good challenge to translate Louise Labé's work into Vietnamese because the language is characterized by its monosyllabic structure and reliance on unique compound words to convey specific meanings. Interested to hear more about that. After this experience, she hopes to explore how emotion, tone, and poetic structure can be preserved or transformed across languages. Lan hopes this will deepen her understanding of language, culture, and communication across different contexts. Thank you, Lan.
Thanks, Scott. Xin chào mọi người. So that's hello in Vietnamese. I will give you like a brief reading, and then I'll take on the notes.
Do you want me to read in French first?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'm brushing up my French here, so excuse me. This is the competitors beyond the Alps, right? OK. Je vis, je meurs, je me brûle et me noie. J'ai chaud extrême en endurant froidure. La vie est trop molle et trop dure. J'ai grands ennuis entremêlés de joie. Tout à coup, je ris et je larmoie, et en plaisir, maintes griffes tourments j'endure. Mon bien s'en va, et à jamais il dure. Tout en un coup, je sèche, je verdois. Ainsi, amour inconstamment me mène, et quand je pense avoir plus de douleur, sans y penser, je me trouve hors de peine. Puis, quand je crois ma joie être certaine, et être au haut de mon désiré heure, il me remet en mon premier malheur.
Thank you. Okay. Tôi sống, tôi chết, tôi vừa cháy và tôi vừa chìm. Tôi nóng bỏng đến cực điểm mà vẫn chịu cái lạnh. Đời tôi quá dịu êm, lại vừa quá khắc nghiệt. Niềm vui hiếm hoi của tôi xen lẫn nhiều nỗi đau khổ. Bốc chốc, tôi cười rồi lại khóc. Và trong niềm vui sướng, tôi vẫn chịu đựng nỗi sầu. Hạnh phúc của tôi sẽ phai dần, nhưng chúng vẫn còn mãi. Tôi sẽ héo tàn, nhưng đột nhiên sẽ tươi lại. Tình yêu dẫn dắt tôi theo cách đổi thay như thế. Và khi tôi nghĩ mình đang đau khổ nhất, không ngờ tôi lại thấy lòng mình nhẹ nhõm. Rồi khi tôi tin niềm vui của mình đã chắc chắn và tưởng đã đạt được đỉnh cao, hạnh phúc mong cầu, anh ta đẩy tôi trở lại về nỗi bất hạnh ban đầu. Okay. So that is the Vietnamese translation. My comments are that this poem was really hard for me because usually I would just translate from my parents verbally, so that's more like street style, right? And, you know, to thoughtfully find like the right words or to match like the sentence or match Labé's intention. It takes a lot of work. I had a lot of people helping me around, like Kate, who helped translate the original French, and as well as my parents and my friends from back home. They were really great help. And in the end, I find this process like extremely fulfilling because when I first read this, I was like, wow, this is like, you know, she died like many hundred years ago, but I can still feel a lot of her emotions in the poem, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, and last up we have Sunny Chi. She is an NYU freshman, a candidate for a bachelor in biochemistry, studying biology, chemistry, and calculus, and then also with us here tonight doing a little bit of the humanities. She scored very high marks at her high school, including in mathematics, chemistry, and physics, and was also awarded the Gaokao School Leaving Certificate among the top 10% of her class. Her familiarity with the chosen language here, Mandarin, is her family language. It is her first language, right, a madrelingua, as it were, and she's interested in spreading Chinese all over the world. Thank you, Sunny.
Shall I read the French?
Yeah, thank you.
OK. Tout aussitôt que je commence à prendre dans le mon lit le repos désiré, mon triste esprit, hors de moi retiré, s'en va vers toi en continuant de se rendre. L'or m'est ta vie que dedans mon sein tendre, je tiens le bien où j'ai tant aspiré et pour lequel j'ai si haut soupiré, que de sanglots est souvent cuit défendre. Ou doux sommeil, ou nuit à moi heureuse, plaisant repos, plein de tranquillité, continuez toute la nuit mon songe. Continuez toute la nuit mon songe. Sorry. Et si jamais ma pauvre âme amoureuse ne doit avoir de bien en vérité, faites au moins qu'elle en ait en mensonge.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Sunny, and I'm going to share my translation that is Mandarin, the simplified Chinese. 当我在柔软的床上享受 渴望已久的休息，我悲伤的灵魂脱离了自我，立即飞向你去寻找欢乐。虽然我柔嫩的胸膛感知到了这样的美好，但在幸福来到之前，我却深深的叹息，伴随着泣不成声的哭泣，甚至离去。哦，香甜的睡眠，哦，幸福的夜晚，愿每个夜晚都如此安宁，愿我永远沉浸在夜晚的美梦中。啊，有爱的灵魂，你虽可怜，但至少享受谎言的光环，来慰藉你被现实打击的心灵。So this is the translation of Mandarin, and this is my first time to translate French into Chinese. So like this is a really special experience for me, and thank you for my professor Ida. She recommended me to like do this translation work, and during the translation, I feel about like this poem is really beautiful and the emotions of the author. So I tried my best to like make my translation clear, and like at the beginning of like every passage, I like use some exclamations to like help us to feel like the emotions of the author. So French is also like really different from Chinese, so I need to find the objects and verbs at first and to make order them to make it clear. So thank you for this experience. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we are going to move now to the second part of our evening and call up our panelists here to engage in a conversation about the poets, the translations, a little bit of everything. You could leave them up. You could leave the ladies up. No? All right, never mind. There we go.
Perhaps you will have the light in your eyes.
Oh, that's okay, I guess.
So I think we might better.
Bring it down? Okay. So I'd like to ask for, we've got Michael Moore, Jane Tylus, and Monica Calabritto. Thank you. Excuse me. Can we get the lights down at all? Maybe not. Maybe, yeah. Oh, maybe? Yes, going down? Wonderful. All right, well, thank you all so much for agreeing to this evening, and hopefully you all also enjoyed the translations. I feel like there's a lot that we could talk about, and so maybe we could just start with your impressions of translation of poetry. I think that's always a fruitful place to begin a conversation like this, because translation of poetry, as we have seen already, is a creative endeavor, and it really never creates, no two forays into poetry translation ever seem to create quite the same thing. So I'd be interested to hear all of your thoughts on, translation of poetry, the work that you have done, the work that you have seen here tonight, perhaps, and maybe your thoughts for why you do it. We could start with Jane.
Oh, wow. Well, I want to thank the 5 of you who did really amazing. Or 6. Translate. Oh, sorry.
We got to do the mic for the recording.
Well, thanks to the wonderful students who.
It's on the bottom. I know, I had to find it too.
Yes. Yeah, it did. Okay, great. No, thanks to the wonderful students who started this evening off. I'm so impressed with the work you've done, and I have a lot of questions. I mean, since I know Spanish a little bit, but I have to say Vietnamese and Mandarin are not languages I've ever studied, and I wish that I had more access to the kinds of things that you were doing with those. I think what I was really impressed with in the Spanish that I could kind of follow was how the rhyming worked in really interesting ways. Señor Dolor, I remember coming out. So that was, again, I love the choices you made along those lines. And then I can also read English. So Joy, I got to understand your translation as well. And you rhymed quite faithfully going through the entire sonnet. I have to say I was maybe like a little bit like Nicole. I mean, I was kind of choosing now and then when something seemed like it kind of worked, but I just felt when I was translating Stampa's 310 poems, it would have taken me probably 310 years, I think, to have made every single sonnet a line in English with the actual sonnet rhyme in the French, in the Italian. And I know that Richard Siebert, whose wonderful translation of Labé, did also translate like Joy each sonnet quite faithfully in terms of the rhyme scheme. He and I kind of would joke, he would say, well, why didn't you do that? I said, Richard, you only had 24 sonnets. And actually, he only had 23, because if you've read Labé's sonnets, you know that the first sonnet is actually in that language called Italian, which she did not translate for her reader into French, right? She left it in Italian. So I always see this sonnet with which Labé opens her 24 poems as this kind of wonderful way of this kind of transitional moment, right? She's acknowledging Petrarch, although unlike Labé, unlike Stampa, she doesn't quote him directly, voi che ascoltate, as Scott said earlier, but she just gives us, okay, here's where I come from, and here's where we're going, girls, right? We're moving into the French language via Italian, but we're not staying there in the Italian. And so anyway, Richard and I would go back and forth, well, you say, how come you didn't do what I did? And I said, Richard, you had only 23 poems. So anyway, I really loved what you did, and I also loved our two Mandarin poems and our Vietnamese poem. I loved the descriptions that you gave of that work as well. I think Arundel, I really liked your very careful and focused discussion of the way that you made choices about divine, where they're bringing the Virgin Mary, and how do you kind of allude to divinity through the flowing of water. And I think that just those are the kinds of, they can seem like very precise and maybe even like limited choices, and yet they change the entire way that your reader is going to be coming to it. So the thought that all of you brought to your poems, I really was impressed by, and have lots of individual questions, and maybe we could talk afterwards or also directly address one another during this conversation. Why poetry? Scott, I guess that was your question, and I've already spoken too much, but...
Absolutely not.
I'm sorry?
Absolutely not. You've not talked too much.
Well, no, I think that it is partly the challenge of the form that made Stampa, for me, so interesting. If I didn't rhyme every line, unlike Joy and Richard Siebert, I did try at least to respond metrically to the syllables, varying sometimes, going down to 8, going up to 14, in lines where I felt Stampa herself was pushing the limit. But I think for the most part, I was trying to kind of recreate more or less, I guess, the kind of rhythm of the Italian, insofar as English permits that, whether it was by choosing, the kind of right kind of syllabic path, or just really kind of relentlessly counting. I had done a verse translation earlier, Lucrezia Tornabuoni de' Medici, who is by no means the greatest woman poet in Italian. She's down about, I think, maybe number 124. But she tried really hard to do verse translations of several biblical books, such as the Book of Judith, the Book of Tobias. She wrote a verse version of the life of St. John the Baptist. But the lexicon was not that interesting. Her syntax, her rhythm weren't all that kind of interesting to me. So I didn't worry about rhythm, and I didn't worry about rhyme. Sometimes I look back at that translation and I wish I had. Stampa was just another figure entirely, and I think her work is so exceptional when you think about how young she was when she passed away. She may have, it seems like she'd already had 2 children. Some people, there was some interesting term about her womb, her ventre, right? Her, and again, I was interested in the word for womb that was being used in the Mandarin, about how she died. Maybe she had a miscarriage, maybe she had an abortion. It's really hard to know. But at any rate, just to say she was very young, she was 33 years old. And in that 33 years, she nonetheless managed not only to put out this extensive, she didn't publish a volume, as Scott said, her sister Cassandra did, but she wrote 310 poems, which have a kind of mastery of the language, a mastery of technique, and also a real form of experimentation, that I thought was just challenging enough that I would give it a shot. I did a lot of my translation on the subway, going back and forth with my sons to school. And I thought if I could do one sonnet every 2 or 3 subway rides, then I would eventually finish, within the space of 2 years. And I kind of did. I look back on it now, lots of mistakes, lots of things I would do differently. There's one very horrible mistake in Sonnet 2 we can talk about. But Joy, I appreciated your being very frank about your mistake. Diletto, I don't think that was that wrong. But anyway, it was a real pleasure working with someone so talented and interesting as Stampa. I'll just say and stop there.
Thank you.
Is this working now?
I think you have to, there's a little switch on the bottom. It's just a little.
Oh, no, it's a tiny switch. I need to change. Hello? Yeah. Yes. Good. I have so many questions, but first I would be reluctant to draw too hard a line between prose and poetry when we're talking about literary language, because I think it was Coleridge. Was it Coleridge who said that poetry is just well-written prose? Yeah, going back to the Romantics who were sort of rebelling against very formal poetry. But in my work, I work also as an interpreter, and I've noticed that if I'm interpreting we'll just call it regular language, and then someone starts quoting a poem or a literary text of any kind, suddenly I'm blocked. Mm-hmm. And it's because that literary language has been done in a very deliberate way, and you don't want to betray that. So it's not just about meaning. So as all of you spoke, you kept talking about intention and meaning, and I think that there's something more. There's maybe because it's the way I experience poetry, which is sometimes I make up my own words, as I'm listening to something, or music as well. It's something about the sounds, and I don't know, somehow a conjuring of this language, somehow lifting it up from the ordinary into something different. There's that. There's also, I was really happy to have the invitation to be here because it was in studying the translations of Petrarch that I came to Italian studies. I was a very happy high school English teacher, really the best job I ever had. And granted, it was on Lake Como, et cetera, but, there was
That'll help.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was in the English lyric class that I was taking at Penn State for my master's that poems by Wyatt and Surrey were presented, and the teacher said, these of course are not translations, and of course they were, because there's always been this issue about literary hierarchies, and translation still continues to be treated as some kind of, artisan or something as opposed to an artist. And to the extent that this professor would not recognize these translations as translations. So I just set about writing a paper disproving everything that he had just said. And that eventually led me in the direction of Italian studies because we were looking at Petrarch, and he's such a huge influence on Western poetry from the time of his life, in the 14th century, all the way up to really 1900, when suddenly everyone fell in love with Dante. Because what was Petrarch doing? He elevated the vernacular. In that period of time, where it was, Latin's so much better than Italian, right? And it's so much, and Greek, ancient Greek, that's the best of all. And Hebrew, if you knew it. There was this whole game that they were playing. And what Petrarch did, a linguist friend explained it to me, because there was always this debate about quantitative versus qualitative verse, whether it's heavy or light syllables, etc., as opposed to the accentual style that we use in our vernacular languages. And he somehow had an ear for both, so he brought the two together. And so he somehow regularized, Italian in his case, and it was through the imitation of Petrarch that other European poets set about doing exactly the same thing. If you're looking at English poetry before Wyatt and Surrey, it's a different matter entirely. It's more irregular, more jagged, and that is the kind of poetry, I would say, that English critics and poets prefer today. That was the big break at the beginning of the 20th century with, Pound, et cetera, the rediscovery of Dante, Eliot as well, Somehow they didn't want this smoothness, which had been the great, I'm calling it smoothness, there might be another word, but that's sort of what it is. There was a column today in the New York Times of McWhorter, and he was talking about the need to return to eloquence, which is a word that I use a lot, and I know that it's something that I find attractive. English historians of English literature tend to be really critical about, like, Spencer, for example, who I think is fantastic, because he has all of these words that they don't know, I guess, you know? And when people see all these fancy words and all this sort of decoration, they're like, what is, this isn't English. I'm like, well, of course it is. I mean, I think that the English language itself has sort of descended into something that is so thoroughly standardized that it was inevitable that we would have AI, you know, just, you know, because of the rules that we're given about the English language. And I'm mentioning this because of the comments that you guys made, for the most part, in the questions that you were raising about translation. Because you talked about syntax a little bit, and you had to move things around. But first of all, you talked about doing a literal translation, and I still don't know what that is when it comes to poetry, you know? And it is a practice certainly among American poets, that they'll have someone who's a native speaker or who knows the language do a very literal translation, and then they gussy it up, and they call it poetry, which is a practice I'm totally against, because that's not what it is. It's not that you're just moving things around at random, you know? Especially if you're looking at, you know, Dante, I'm thinking of what he, maybe because so there is that issue. The issue of meaning, too, as I said right from the outset, there's more than meaning that's involved in poetry. And how does it hit your ear? You know, why is it engraved on your memory in a certain way? You know, you make sentences that are memorable, and this had become my practice. As I've translated more and more prose, I've, you know, moved away from literalness. And I would just tell people, I mean, fidelity is overrated. I mean, come on, we are in a kind of polyamorous world after all, right? And so this idea that you start with this very literal thing, of course you have to know the language, you have to be competent. But you have to figure out in that poem, what's the device, what makes it work? Because in one of the poems, I think one of the earlier ones, it seemed to be a series of oppositions, you know, a series of oxymoron. And that's the thing that I would say that you should work from the inside out when you're doing a poem. I'm saying this also to myself. I mean, I did experimental poetry a long time ago, and I find just translating a simple sentence so difficult that just to do something experimental, I'm like, you know, why don't I just hang myself then? But I've been thinking a lot about going back to poetry because, I mean, after doing that 600-page novel, when I'm doing prose, I want it to move forward. It has to be dynamic. With poetry, it does sit still. I can sort of dig into the meaning of words. I mean, so the meaning is important, but not meaning in its literal sense of what the dictionary definition is, but what it means in a fuller sense within that poem. You know, why is there the emphasis on that word and how that word is transformed through the poet's work? So, and the final question that I would ask, I'd have more questions than this, but I was also sort of wondering what poetic practice was in the languages that you were translating into. You know, what were the translations? Have you looked, for example, at what other poets might do? A Chinese friend of mine does he does contemporary work, you know, and I don't really know what his practices are. I mean, you know, since I don't have access to the language, but I'm sort of curious about, you know, since translation is so important to the communication between cultures, that I'm sort of wondering how it is dealt with in your respective countries.
Okay, great questions. Monica?
Okay, so I am not a translator. I only play one here on stage. And I just teach Louise Labé several classes on love here in New York and in other cities as well. And so I happened to come across to Louise Labé, and because of my interest with Petrarchan sonnets, with Petrarchan notion of love. And what fascinates me in Labé is her way of transforming Petrarch from the inside. So, and Rosalind Jones talks about assimilation with a difference when she talks about Louise Labé. And that's why, for instance, she, in the Sonnet 8 that was translated in, I think, Mandarin, or Vietnamese. Sonnet
number 8
right?
was Vietnamese.
Sonnet in
yes.
Vietnamese. Yes. That was a response or an echo of a very, very famous sonnet by Petrarch. which is all made of antitheses, okay? And so I don't come here as a translator. I'm interested in translation, but I am not expert in translation. I didn't translate Gaspara Stampa. I didn't translate The Betrothed, that's for sure. But I come here with an idea of translation as a cultural way of appropriating and assimilating canonical text, such as, for instance, Petrarca's De Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta. And I came here with a book that I use in my class, which is the new translation for The Other Voice by Annie Finch. And you mentioned, Jane, the other translator of Les Œuvres by Louise Labé. And Annie Finch did a translation that I found very interesting. I cannot really judge the translation, but it's very interesting. I'm going to read something that she wrote, she wrote about her translation. And she says that when I started this project, I decided to render Labé's poems in accordance with their original designs. I felt important to translate each of Labé's poems not only into the Italian sonnet form, but also into the particular version of the Italian sonnet rhyme scheme she had originally found for it, because the poem's ceaseless, anguished struggle with love as its appropriate incarnation in the repetitive intensity of Labé's rhymes. So what Finch is trying to do is to read, as Michael was saying, the poem from inside out. So she's trying to express the content, which is this anguished tone about love, the pain of love, but also the productive element of this pain, which is completely different from what Petrarca does in Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta. There is this sense of repentance, there is this sense of anguish. Here, anguish is productive. And so that's why Louise Labé is considered a proto-feminist in the vein of Gaspara Stampa. And she's also used and abused as a figure of a legendary proportions, a person, a poet who is who fought for Harry II, that she wore an armor, etc. So there's a lot of legend around Louise Labé. But what my students find very interesting, both graduate and undergraduate, is something that the last student who the first student who translated in Vietnamese the poem, the Sonnet 8, she talked about emotion. She was interested about emotion, tone, and poetic structure. And I think that putting these things together, emotion, especially the emotion of love, into a poetic structure that is so canonical, such as the sonnet, is extremely powerful for undergraduate students. And even if they read the text in translation, in English translation, they find that the words that Labé uses are in a way contemporary. I heard from my students that Louise Labé was like Michelangelo, who is another author whom I use a lot in my courses on love, is extremely contemporary to them. It's modern. They can find the anguish and the sadness that they feel themselves. Now, is this the right interpretation? Maybe not. We can talk also. One of the things that I was reading this morning for a totally different project was led me to the difference between emic and etic. So what is emic and what is etic? What is the intention that the author had? And what is the interpretation that we give as readers? And so Labé, in a way, is a person who interpreted, like many other people, the Petrarchian model, the Petrarchian sonnets, and made it her own. And so in these 24 sonnets, because they are very, short amount of, short number, and 3 elegies, which I suggest you to read because they're very important, and the discourse between la folie et la raison, and the love, Louise Labé expressed and established a very powerful, very compacted, powerful way to be in dialogue with the Italian literary and poetic canonical tradition of the time. So I don't know how much I can tell you about translation, but I really enjoyed your translations, even when I couldn't understand anything.
I was thinking when you were talking about love, I was thinking of the fact that it's a complicated word in the Italian language. You don't tell someone, at least in the South. In the North, I lived in the North, but my friends were all Southern. But you don't say "ti amo," you say "ti voglio bene," and then how are you going to make that distinction if you are trying to cover it in English, "ti voglio bene"? That's yes, I love you, but you don't say "ti amo," right? It's quite, And meanwhile, Italy has produced so much love poetry.
Absolutely, yes.
Interesting. So, as you all were talking, I couldn't help but notice the recurrence of someone that, of course, I was talking about at the beginning too, but Petrarch. And I feel like there's such an importance in the poetry of both Labé and Stampa on something that I feel is really unique and was really eye-opening for me when I first made the connection of this and Petrarch, which is the notion of interiority in poetry, which is something that even Jane was saying in her introduction to Stampa, that Stampa's world is an interior one, that we're not really talking about this exterior place. So and I think this is especially interesting too, Michael, thinking about the fact that you just embarked on this grand translation of Promessi Sposi, a work, a seminal work of Italian literature of the 1800s, and thinking about perhaps whether interiority, maybe the importance of interiority within poetry is interiority, the idea of expressing one's interior emotions. Is that something which is, certainly there's interiority, I would say, also in Manzoni. It has to be there. You know what the characters are thinking, and yet, bless you, there's something about poetry that can convey interiority in a maybe a more succinct way, if I dare say.
Well, if you think of Addio ai Monti, that's poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take liberties. They call them liberties, or I don't understand that whole way of talking about translation in a sense. And I'm trying to think myself of ways to talk about translation that are honest, that are really a reflection of what I'm doing, as opposed to, because when we talk about art, you have this language of proposals, right? Because you need a publisher, you need a grant, and you start talking about things in those terms that you think they're going to like. And then when you present, then you start using those same terms again. But it's a performance of the sort, that it doesn't really reflect what's happening. Mm-hmm. But I would say certainly, I found that much of Manzoni's prose was poetic. I would look at a paragraph as a stanza of a poem, and you would see the way that he would, invert sentences and stuff like that, the same way that a poet might. Mm-hmm. And I think that his best poetry is in the, Promessi Sposi, as opposed to his poetry,
Please.
I was fascinated. Once again, I go back to the young woman who translated the Labé 8 in Vietnamese, because what struck me very much was also that you talked about something as a collective translation, so to speak. You were helped by different people. I was curious because, as I said, I'm amateur. I'm not a professional translator, etc. But I wanted to ask you, how did you experience this sort of collective translation? How did you do it?
So I think, at least in my culture, love is very different, or at least how I was raised. We are very serious, very filial piety, like very devoted to ancestors and stuff like that. So romantic love is not really prioritized until like more like contemporary decades where there's more prominent writers that writes about love. But with like my parents or my friends, there's like old type of like the old view of love. And then there's also like the younger one, which is more childish or puppy love. And I feel like when I was interpreting this poem, I am quite immature, so I could see and feel a lot of Labé's emotion. But when my parents read over my translation, they were like, what are you talking about? But I think it was fun because then I could like kind of try to get out of myself and see what other people would interpret Labé's poem and like translate it to them as well.
I had a question for you as well, which is I was wondering about the influence of the French language on Vietnamese, since the French were in, Indochine for so long, as they called it, that I would imagine that there was quite a bit of at least French vocabulary.
Like a little. I'd say that colonization had definitely impacted my country a lot, economically, and then also like just socially as well, because there was a hierarchy, and I guess like our monarchy was displaced.
Well, I was wondering, are there a lot of loan words, for example?
Oh, I mean, like cafe, coffee, pate. I can't think of it on top of my head, but I'm sure there's a lot of words. But as you can see with the alphabet, it's based on Latin, and it was written like that after colonization.
I was wondering about the alphabet. So, and when did that come into circulation?
Okay, I'm not the brightest history
I'm sorry.
student.
I'm not pressing you as an historical linguist. Here,
maybe like 17th, 18th.
Oh, so that late. Interesting.
Yeah, maybe a little. I don't know. I think before that, before France, it was China that colonized us.
Yeah.
But our language was influenced a lot by both of those countries. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
It's funny because there's a volume of essays by various translators from Asian languages, and I could see it. They were operating for a completely different matrix than I was, and then I might have grown up in, because they were talking about the translation that was done for the sake of colonization. Missionaries, for example, the way translation was used as a way of converting people and of taking dominance. Also, there's this Irish play called Translations by Brian McFeel, and talks about how the British came in and they were renaming everything with English names. And so it was a sort of appropriation of another culture through and I had always thought instead of translation as something that improved the English language, at least,
No, and while the mic is there, I'm sorry, do you want to respond to Michael?
No, I could definitely feel like there's still existing infrastructure of colonization. The city I lived in, there's still a lot of old architecture, like French architecture. Like the roads are named in French, some of them. My grandpa has lived through colonization, so he had to learn French while also learning Mandarin and Vietnamese. So it was a lot. But yeah, that was very insightful. Thank you.
No, I was just going to say that I noticed that you retained the 14 lines, and Sunny and Arendelle, you had 11 or 12 lines in your translations, and so I'm just curious about that. I mean, I know there's such a thing as a Spanish sonnet, so that kind of makes sense. I don't know if there's such a thing as a Vietnamese sonnet, but again, in the Mandarin, I noticed that both of you didn't, quote, give us a 14-line rendition, and I'm just really curious about that. And Sunny, if the mic's there, if you want to start.
I think the lines depend on the language.
Depend on the what? I'm sorry.
Depend on my language. I want to make it more clear, so I will definitely to make it short. Yeah. So make people directly to get my emotions from the poems. I think so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
In the context of love poetry, the idea of courtship which I think is completely absent from your generation, right? Even dating, I don't know whether people do they say dating anymore, or you do date, okay, but I mean, but. Are you going out with someone? We used to say, I don't know, you know, I try to refresh my own language by talking to my nieces and nephews, but I wonder. But courtship, I thought of as a suitor, for example, a suitor. I mean, it is a weird word, but.
I was wondering if our translators have questions for our panelists.
I have a very specific question, but I don't know if that. Okay. And it's a very specific wording, so I don't know if you'll remember. I mean, 300, 1 out of 300 is a lot to think about. But so for number 9, your translation in the first stanza. Well, I'll read the first stanza. Profound joy, great and infinite delight. Now that my beloved treasure's near, how that I often talk with him and gaze at him, my breast would certainly fill to bursting. And that last one honestly made me laugh out loud when I read it, because I don't know, it just was really surprised me. So I was wondering if you had if you could remember what you were thinking when you translated that. If you don't remember the Italian, I have it here.
True.
Because, I mean, what even when I was like looking at the literal translations of the words, none of it is exploding or bursting. There's like in ingombrerebe, which is like more encumbered, and then I think what Professor Kayatsa and I had determined was. We thought that petto in this case would be more like heart or, yeah. So if you remember your thoughts on that.
Well, let's see. This is 16 years ago. You weren't even born yet. I do remember thinking about it and going back and forth. And I have a little footnote there which takes us to the poem that, for me, I think Stampa was absolutely fixated on, which is Sappho's, I think it's number 31, her poem about when she is near, when she looks at this man who's near her beloved, the jealousy, and she's just about to, she can't think. She loses all sense of time. She can't move. She's going to burst open. So I definitely was playing quite loosely with this here, as I saw what again is this kind of weird word, ingombrerebe il petto. There's certainly a sense of heaviness here, and I think you're absolutely right. It's burdened. It's a weight. It's just something so massively heavy that I just took a little bit of freedom here, and said, so heavy it would burst. The breast as opposed to the heart, il petto. I do remember thinking about that too, and I just wanted to. Il cuore, she uses il cuore throughout her sonnets. There's no question, and I was like, she didn't use that here. Il petto is very much, the bosom, but I didn't use the word bosom, but it was breast. So I think that I just wanted to give this sense, I wanted to convey the sense of weight and the enormity of it, but also it would happen were it not for the fact, and then I wanted, and then we had to move to the very next line. I mean, one thing that perhaps those of you who did the Stampa might have picked up is that even though we have, 4 discrete stanzas, as it were, she's very fluid in terms of moving among them. I mean, sometimes she even has some movement between where the 2 quatrains end and the 2 tercets begin between lines 8 and 9, which is quite unusual at this point. For many, there'll be much more flexibility and experimentation later in the 16th century. So I think I also wanted to play with that. It would fill my heart to bursting were it not for. To make sure that kind of continuity was there. So you're right. It's not there in the Italian. The enormous, the bursting. But I think that I wanted to convey, perhaps erroneously, perhaps correctly, the sapphic kind of moment here of explosion. Because her 31st poem, which had, as I say in my much too long introduction to Stampa's poems, had only recently been kind of recovered through this treatise where it was kind of embedded. I mean, we don't have a collection of Sappho's poems from the 6th century, but there's nothing. But there had recently been circulated a treatise in which this very important poem of Sappho's was found, this one important fragment was found. So again, I was doing that, maybe a little bit over the top, but I also just wanted to make sure we understood the force of what was going on here. I mean, what I love about this sonnet, and by the way, I love your all-consuming joy as a way in. I like it much better than my really, really boring, profound joy. So in my second edition of this, should it ever happen, I'm going to change that and I'll footnote you, I promise. Thanks to Joy Fraser. Anyway, but I think that there's a real sense here in which there's so few poems where they're together. And yet, they've only been together for like 6 sonnets at this point. Those few of you in the audience who may have read the whole narration. And yet, it's not really all-consuming joy at the end of the day because she's so worried it's going to end. And it does end. Yeah. I mean, the guy leaves her for another woman, or he goes to France. I mean, the interesting thing about, Labé's lover comes to Italy and Stampa's lover goes to France. And again, in another kind of fantasy world, I'd love to think that Stampa couldn't have read Labé, but I'd love to think that Labé read Stampa. Mm-hmm. Stampa's poems came out in 1554, shortly after her death, thanks to her sister. Labé's poems came out in 1556. They both lived in the two of the great centers of publishing in Europe. Venice, by far the most advanced city for publishing, maybe in all of Europe, but certainly in Italy. And Lyon, where Labé was from, was just over the border, actually, when you think about it, and was also a major publishing capital. So, as we talk about interiority, I totally agree, but there's so much yearning in these women to be heard and to be understood and to find like-minded other women. Sappho, perhaps, but also women of their own time. So I would love to think again, and maybe my own little fantasy head, that as Stampa is maybe not saying she's bursting open, but I'm saying she's bursting open, that this is both her access point to Sappho, but it's also saying, I would just burst open if I could, but I'm so afraid this isn't going to last. So I'm not going to burst open. So it's, anyway, thank you for picking up on that. And I do very much think that the way you did it was much more faithful to what's actually there. And and your question gives me a lot to think about, and it opens up issues of translation, right? How free can we be as translators, and how much should we let our own reading of something, and where we think it fits in a certain tradition, how much can or should that influence or not what we give? But there's always a risk
of. I think sometimes there's this presumption that a translation is like a glass over the original, but it shouldn't be neutral. I mean, it has to be a bunch of judgments that you make word for word or sentence, I mean, because if it's neutral, it's going to be dead in the water, I think,
That's really helpful. Thank you. I am also taking a translation course right now for Italian, and one of the conversations we have a lot is like, how faithful to the text do we stay? It's for prose and not poetry, but it's been interesting to make connections actually, and to do poetry instead of prose was kind of an interesting change. But one of the things we kind of talk about is when there's the same word repeated. And so the fact that you made that she does say core, and then this time it's petto, that's really interesting to notice. Thank you. That was helpful.
Any other questions from our translators in the audience? Yeah, Randall.
Hi, I want to first thank you for coming here and to hear our sharings on the poems. And I do have a more general question that I encountered while I was translating. So beforehand, you mentioned how translation is never a neutral process. There's always a judgment. And I just comes to think of how there's two approaches in translation. One is called foreignization, the other is domestication, coined by Lawrence Venuti. And I encountered this term during my course seminar called Translation Theory with Professor Hala Halim. And we encountered a work by an Egyptian writer called Nagi Mahfouz, his work Midak Ali. And there's two versions. The first version was published in 1960s. So at that time, Egyptian literature were not reached by that much introduced into the West. So the translator, they took on more a domestication like approach, so that mass Western audiences could understand. I believe the author is called like either Legassic or Humphrey Davies, and the other but 40 years later when it was retranslated, I think like when I read the piece, the English version, it was more like I could sense there was more like foreignization. It kept more of the like original meanings of it. And so my question is like, what were your perspectives, like how to balance foreignization and domestication, and like what were your preferences like towards these two approaches? Yeah.
It's funny because I kind of reject that terminology because you do both. First of all, within the same sentence even, and a lot, and you do all of these. First of all, it's one thing to theorize about translation, and it's another to do it. Because when you're doing it, you are working with an editor, you're working with a publisher, you're working with expectations, you're thinking of the reader. I mean, I certainly think of the reader. And a lot of the work is done in the revision stage, which just never ends. I was thinking like William Weaver, the great translator from Italian, talked about how when he started out, or maybe in the 60s, they didn't let him say pasta, or he had to say noodles. Because then it was recognizable to an American reader, which I can understand. But a noodle, I mean, there's a difference between the egg noodles of the Pennsylvania Dutch country and pasta asciutta, right? I mean, but you would never say pasta asciutta in English either, would you? So you do want to, I personally want to convey aspects of Italian that are not just words, sentence structure sometimes. I really try to get away with what I can in terms of inverting sentence structures and using emphasis. Every now and then I've only once used a double negative, which I had to, in the premise. It needed it, But I like to convey an Italian way of saying things. For example, as long as I lived in Italy and I worked in an Italian office for 25 years, no matter how hard I tried to assimilate the language, they always said that I was too direct, because the Italian language, spoken well, is very indirect. You use the impersonal a lot, you use the passive, all these things that tell you never to do in English. And I try to respect those. I don't use a lot of the poise, like the way that they will construct a sentence to indicate time moving. I find that just boring. But a friend of mine says, no, it's very important. Use all those poise. I'm like, no way. We don't need that in English. So, it's never all one thing,
I'd like to turn the question back on you and ask you about some of the choices you made. I know you say you decided, I'm really interested, you explicitly kind of mentioned the Virgin Mary. I mean, we don't have Stampa saying that explicitly, but you're creating a context for your reader in Mandarin, which they may not have, or they may not, be familiar with that. I also was really struck by your discussion of how you use two characters to translate the Italian word fortuna, or fortune, and then there was a third term, which in Italian is altezza, or this is just kind of, I think the word I used was something like domain, and you went into a really nice explanation of domain, and I thought the way that you gave it a kind of sacred meaning totally captured what in the Italian is this idea of altezza, which really just means height, but it's coming across as the heavens. So I felt that, I'd love to hear just your thoughts on your choices between this foreignization, domestication issue.
But if I could add to that also, I mean, since you talked about religious terms like the creator, I was wondering whether, Mandarin Chinese had been sort of purified of religious references, with the arrival of the,
Yeah.
Like the creator, I tend to relate to the term. It's called like Genesis. In Chinese, it's called 创世纪. So I think that is a term that is newly created just based on this Western terminology. And there's also kind of like these imported terms, like in English, there's like sofa. In Chinese, it's 沙发. So you can see how the sounds very similar. And also chocolate, 巧克力. Like these kind of terms, so these are imported into like China. And so based on I think because I study both English and Chinese, I just think that it's kind of it's very easy for me to find a word that means directly like creator or like sublime or lofty in Chinese. But it's very hard to actually mimic or to imitate the original, like their rhythm or just the rhythm or the flow of the language. I think that part is the most difficult because I think each language they adopt or they obtain a different kind of like rhythmic based on their own culture, norms, and values. And I think that is unique, and we should not imitate them. Yeah.
So that explains your sonnet lines not existing. Yeah, no, that's really, that goes back to what Sunny said as well. Getting the meaning across, having the flow in Mandarin in a way that, the sonnet line per se would really offset that. That's really striking. Thank you, Sarah.
No. I actually wanted to say that I was impressed by your explanation of, first of all, the importance that you gave to the sound. You asked us to play, attention to the sound in Mandarin, and also the fact that you said that you pointed out, even though of course I can't understand Mandarin, but the structure of the phrase. The difference between the English that has like a subject, a verb, and then an object, an indirect object, vis-a-vis or versus the Mandarin where you have instead the correlative, what you call the correlative first, and then the essential last. So I wonder how that translated into your interpretation of the sonnet by Gaspara Stampa.
So because I'm from China, Beijing. So there's like different dialects in Chinese, and the different dialects they have different order of the language. For example, in English you say "Have you eaten?" or "Have you eaten anything?" "Have you ate anything?" But in Chinese we can either say in different dialects. For example, like in Sichuanese we can say like "饭否," food, eat. Or in Chinese, we can say "eat food." Like these, we play around with the orders of these kind of things. And so also I think in English we have a very strict grammar that is on scene in Chinese, because we don't have like these past tenses or like single plurals. So that is something I have to encounter while I translate.
I was wondering with some of the rest of you, though, that you did not do a lot of explaining. And I was wondering why, because, whether you can articulate it or not, you're making a lot of little decisions as you translate, right? And I'm wondering if things came to you later or you didn't think it was worth getting into, or I'm just sort of wondering what your strategy was in terms of after what could you add to that?
I think one of my favorite parts is the last word. In order to keep the rhyme, I used a non-real world word, soulment, to rhyme with the moment and other endings. And I actually asked my mom, who was like an English major and has done some translation between Spanish and English, if she thought it would be okay to use a made-up word. And I was like, in passing and fun things, she will say like, "Oh, I'm an English major, I can make up words." That's like my entitlement or whatever. But and I was like, but this is like presenting to other people. Do you think it would be okay? And I had just kind of gone with the decision, yes, because it felt like it was sticking to the meaning. Because I feel like there wasn't. I think I don't have the line anymore, but it was that the last line is meaning that like he is the support that like sustains her life basically, and so soulment for me was like that her soul was being sustained by him, and so I felt that still went with the translation, and then there was another part to try and maintain the translation again with that int. I did know it, which is like a close rhyme or soft rhyme, I think. And yes, because I can't remember what it was supposed to be, or like of knowing, like the knowledge, I think, and so I had done like know it, but and then I think particularly for my translation, it was a lot of like trying to understand what she wanted to say, and then figuring out a way to get the right ending at the end of the sentence. And honestly, something I never thought about was the rhythm or the syllables, I guess, in each line. I was only thinking about the rhyme at the end.
With the question, I mean, when you say what she wanted to say, I mean, the question I ask is, why is she saying it this way? You know? Because there's so many ways you could say it, right?
I don't think I thought about that.
Nicole, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I guess in like my translation process, like my professor is Cuban, and so I'm Peruvian, and so what like this constant like battle, I guess, between like Spanish speakers is like what is the correct Spanish, and like what words like there's a lot of words like that are like straw is like a big like for me it's cañita, and then like in other countries it's like pito or whatever other words that like could mean completely different things in Spanish. So it was like this constant like I guess like not argument but debate between me and my professor of just like no, I don't think that goes correctly. So it was I think that's what my process was like when translating to Spanish, because of like how I wanted to make it seem just like more understandable for like everyone who speaks Spanish, not just like my Peruvian Spanish. I don't know if that makes sense.
Those sort of linguistic divides. I was thinking of Garcia Marquez, who's one of his first novels, when it was published in Spain, they changed all of his Colombianisms to, to make them more madrileño. And so suddenly all of these Colombian peasants sounded like citizens of Madrid, And he bought up every copy and destroyed it, and from then on had a clause in his contract that they could not do that. They could not Hispanize his Spanish,
All right,
You guys?
we're ready. I want to add maybe some final notes here.
So for mine, like I tried to keep it as faithful to Labé's like contradictions, like as possible. Like she has a lot of paradoxes, like I live, I die, like I burn, I drown, or just like very descriptive like sentences. And in Vietnamese, like you can like say something as simple as you want, or you can make it as complex as you want. Like because the language is monosyllabic, you can be as descriptive as possible, and I just want to be faithful to her, like I guess like her work, and so I try to like connect the expressions that I know and that would like be familiar with like the people around my age with like, the language, the way that I speak and the way that my friends and I speak to her work. So very contemporary, I guess, but faithful.
Yeah, like for me, my translation is really focusing on like rhythms and flows, because like I'm really influenced by like classic poems from like Tang Dynasty or Qing Dynasty. So like during that time, like people usually have like 4 lines or 8 lines for their poems to make it really short, but like express their emotions as much as possible. So like for my translations, I use like some exclamations, like yeah, like to make people feel like the feelings like directly. I think so, yeah.
And on that note, I think we have to say thank you both to our translators and to our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much.